Welcome to the Debka File, a weekly roundup of exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East, broadcast to you live from the heart of the region. Coming up on the program today, Iran presses Russia and Syria to guarantee backing against a U.S.-Israel attack in Syria. U.S. and Israel poised to strike Iran in Syria. Iraqi Shiite militia bombed by U.S.-Israeli forces. U.S.-Russia rift on Syria mars Bolton-Petrushev meeting. Hezbollah's Nasrallah defies Iran. Russia, Iran, and Syria prepare to take last rebel bastion in Idlib. Trump appoints new coordinator for Syrian conflict. And now to our top headlines. Iran's defense minister, Amir Khatami, arrived in Damascus on Sunday and demanded that Russia and Syria would agree to support al-Quds forces under a U.S.-Israel assault. He claimed that he was in Damascus to strengthen the Iranian-Syrian resistance front.
This was Iran's response to the plan set forth by the U.S. and Israel to launch a joint offensive against the Iranian al-Quds brigades and the Shiite militias in Syria. The plan was finalized last week between U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton and Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Meanwhile, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has forced Russia and the U.S. to make an important decision, either confront one another in Syria or back down. The U.S. and Israel did not predict that Iran would go to these measures when they finalized their plans to destroy Iranian forces in Syria.
امریکا خوب می‌داند که اگر کمترین آسیبی به این ملت وارد بیاره تا همه دنیا تعقیبش می‌کنیم و به روز ذلت می‌نشانیمش. هزینه این جنگ برای امریکا یک هیولاست، چون میفهمه اگر کمترین آسیبی به این نظام اسلامی وارد بشه تنها امریکا مورد هدف قرار نمیگیره، هم پیمان امریکا در منطقه رژیم صهیونیستی هم مورد هدف قرار خواهد گرفت. همین تازه به دوران رسیده امریکا هم تا کنون بیش از 8 بار تقاضای مذاکره کرده. امروز با کمال وقاحت این دروغگو میگوید که من در پی مذاکره نیستم، حالا ایرانی‌ها اگر خواستن قبول میکنن. چرا دروغ میگید؟ شما اصلا برجامو به هم زدید برای مذاکره جدید با ایران. برجامو به هم زدید تا اقتدار موشکیان در این مذاکره بگنجانید. برجامو به هم زدید تا اقتدار منطقه‌ای ایران را در این مذاکره بگنجانید، ولی این بار هم مسئولان نظام اسلامی ما آرزوی مذاکره را بر دلتون خواهند گذاشت.
This Iranian plan caught the U.S. and Israel in the advanced stages of planning an operation targeting the Iranian military in Syria, which was aimed at several key forces. These entities include the al-Quds chief, Major General Qasem Soleimani, the Revolutionary Guard's foreign arm, the al-Quds brigades, the Lebanese Hezbollah, and 21 Shiite militias from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan.
The final stages of planning were made during the meeting between U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton and Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, along with members of Israel's National Security Council. Debka military sources reveal that the final blueprint is the culmination of several months of work following U.S. President Trump's withdrawal from the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The plan is for Israeli and U.S. special forces to target the military infrastructure in Syria, which was put in place by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's al-Quds forces. This mission will take place over several months until next spring, unless Tehran decides to bolt on its own accord due to financial strain. Debka sources report that Bolton revealed to Russian security advisor Patrushev about the operation on Thursday, which was the first follow-up on the agreements made between the U.S. and Russian presidents in Helsinki on July 16th. If the plan remains in motion, the Israelis and Americans will move forward with their joint operation against Iran in Syria. However, if the Kremlin raises objections, Trump will be forced to decide whether to adhere to Putin's decision and delay the operation or to move forward. Trump has been making plans for Syria more quickly than he did for North Korea, and the Israeli government sees that a direct military confrontation against Iran could be imminent.
Just to be clear, regime change in Iran is not American policy. But what we want is massive change in the regime's behavior. The consequences of the reduction in resources available to the regime, we think, is already manifest in some extent in constraints on the Quds force in Syria and Iraq, and perhaps also in its assistance to the Houthis in Yemen. And that's very important. We're going to do other things to put pressure on Iran as well, beyond economic sanctions. We talked about that.
The first strike in the combined U.S.-Israel operation against Iran took place last Thursday when the pro-Iranian Iraqi Kataib Hezbollah Shiite militia was bombed on the Syrian-Iraqi highway. This Iraqi militia belonged to Qasem Soleimani's forces.
Debka File reports that prior to the attack, the Iranian general was in the middle of an operation seizing control of the Iraqi-Syrian highway and deploying troops in the western Iraqi province of Anbar, prepared to cross the border and counter the coming U.S.-Israeli operation in Syria. Since Soleimani began the initiative, there have been 6 attacks of the weapons depots of the Iraqi Shiite Brigade. This militia, which was founded by the highest religious authority in Iraq, refuses to adhere to Soleimani. The explosions were intended to drive this military out of the way so Iran could build a land bridge from Iraq to Syria for troops to cross over the border. Debka File military sources report that Soleimani's tactics mean a U.S.-Israel operation against Iran in Syria would need to reach into western Iraq.
The airstrike on the Iraqi Shiite convoy took place during the meeting between Bolton and Russian security advisor Nikolai Patrushev in Geneva and was intended to warn Moscow that the U.S. would follow through with military action to get Iranian forces out of Syria. It was reported that following the meeting, Bolton said that he and Patrushev had discussed removing Iran's presence from Syria.
The following day, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov warned America against taking steps in Syria, while Russian lawmakers instructed for the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Syria. The 5 Russian warships sent this week to the Syrian port of Tartus were, according to Moscow, responding to the buildup of U.S., British, and French naval forces in the region. The division of labor in Syria, defined by U.S. President Trump and Russian President Putin at the Helsinki summit, which resulted in U.S. acceptance of Syrian and Iranian forces up to Israel's Golan border, were no longer valid, as Putin did not have the Russian forces he promised to Trump and Netanyahu to secure the southwestern Syrian borders with Israel and Jordan against incursions by General Soleimani's forces. Trump responded by backing off the plan to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. Now he plans for joint Israel-U.S. forces to attack Iran's Al-Quds brigades. Members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard's Al-Quds brigades are at the forefront of those in Tehran who oppose dialogue with Washington on an amended nuclear accord. Putin believes this change in Trump's strategy is a threat to Russian interests in Syria as well as to the Assad regime. Experts believe that an attack on Iran and Syria will convince Tehran to pull back from Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, which will remove a major threat to the Middle East, Red Sea, and Arabian Peninsula.
With us to discuss this is Dr. Reuven Berko, commentator on Israel Hayom Daily on Arab Affairs. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So do you believe Russia and Syria will agree to support Al-Quds forces?
Well, I would define the Russian approach toward the story of Iranian involvement in Syria as something that they must live with, not something they would like to participate and share for a long time. We could hear several responses to this question from senior official Russians that say that actually they would like Iran to go away from Syria, but they cannot do it, they cannot supply the good. On the other hand, the Iranians say we are there in Syria on the basis of legitimacy since we were invited to Syria by the government of Syria, meaning to say Bashar al-Assad himself. So I expect that, I predict that they will stay there as unsatisfied partners for a long time to see.
What do you think will be Netanyahu's strategy in response to Khatami's incentives?
I believe that Netanyahu's policies cannot be derived only by the Israeli interests, but it's a holistic strategic point of view being shared with Americans and the Gulf states altogether, because the threat of Iran is not a sole problem for Israel. It is a problem that threatens all the Middle East. You can see the involvement and the threats on the Iranian threats on the Gulf states, on Hormuz Straits. So, for example, and you can see the efforts of Iran towards Syria, through Lebanon, on Israel and Jordan and Egypt. All this area is under threat. So the policy of Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, will be, as I believe, part of a holistic strategic program.
What do you think will be the best way forward for Israel and the U.S. to respond to Khatami's ultimatum?
Well, as you can see and watch the Iranians, the more they are desperate and the more they are in a problem as a result of the American policy, they release a lot of threats. One of them you can see from even Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah, that are now dealing with the triangular of Saudi Arabia, the United States and Israel as those who are getting decision in the Middle East. They describe the Israelis as frightened soldiers who go to psychiatrists all the time. They release a lot of threats. Amir Hatimi, for example, threatening obviously, and Iran are making muscles on their patrols and behavior in the Hormuz Straits. I believe that they are now preparing for some American leadership on a military level, but at the end of the day, I believe that the vector of the real acts being made by economic sanctions made by America, this will be the crucial step that make the Iranian withdrawal. They cannot finance these terrorist organizations in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon for a long time, suffering from internal economic problems that raise the public against them. I believe that the sanctions are the most beneficial way to overcome the threat of Iran.
What do you think Israel's new strategy will be since the agreements made at the Helsinki summit have taken a new turn?
Well, as for us, it's strategic, but in connection or in the context of the story of the involvement of Americans and the Gulf states, this is tactical. I mean, in comparison of the strategical means, what Israel will keep on doing is preventing Iranian forces getting closer to the Israeli borders, mainly on the Golan Heights. I believe that they'll keep on maintaining this area empty of any Iranian involvement. We have proved to fulfill this mission for several times in the past.
Do you think this showdown in Syria involving the U.S. and Russia will take off, or do you think one of the parties will back down? And if so, who do you think will be the first to back down?
I believe that at the end of the day, there will be no military clash between America and others and the Iranians. What will be the crucial for the next step being made by Iran is the sanctions. I believe that at the end of the day, the sanction will decrease the involvement of Iran in terrorist movements such as Hamas, such as the Houthi in Yemen, and mainly Hezbollah. There will be no possibility for Iran to fund those terrorist movements any longer.
Do you believe that an attack on Iran and Syria will convince Tehran to pull back from Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen?
I do not believe that there will be a very, in the coming days, or even in the predicted future, there will be any military attack. I believe that the sanction will make its own effect, and this is better for all sides. In addition to this, I believe that even Iranians, including Hezbollah, knows that the superiority of the military abilities of the West are much better and destructive than they have by their own. So I believe that even they themselves would prevent themselves from any involvement in military crash against America and Israel. The results are very, very much predictable. Everybody knows it.
That's Dr. Reuven Berko. Thank you so much for your insight today.
Thank you.
For the first time in the Syrian war, Hezbollah has opted out of the alliance between Russia, Iran, and Syria. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has defied Iran, causing disarray in pro-Iranian Shiite militia ranks in Syria.
Several chiefs previously threatened to end ties with the Al-Quds General Soleimani and communicate with Tehran through Nasrallah. Since the 2006 war between Israel and Lebanon, the head of Iran's proxy has never defied Tehran until now. Nasrallah had this to say at a ceremony in Beirut.
سنخرج قريبا إن شاء الله من هذه الحرب الكبرى على منطقتنا وعلى محور المقاومة في منطقتنا منتصرين لنحتفل بهذا الانتصار الإلهي التاريخي العظيم القادم قريبا جدا. المقاومة اليوم في لبنان فيما تمتلك من سلاح ومن عتاد ومن إمكانات ومن عديد ومن كادر ومن قدرة ومن خبرات ومن تجاوب وأيضا من إيمان ومن عزم ومن شجاعة ومن إرادة هي أقوى من أي زمان مضى منذ انطلاقتها في هذه المنطقة. العقوبات أنا لا أقول أنها لا تؤثر، بالتأكيد أنها تؤثر، يعني ما مش صحيح نكابر، لكن العقوبات لن تمس إرادتنا ولا عزمنا ولا تصميمنا ولن تمس قوتنا أيضا. اعملوا العقوبات اللي بدكم إياها. نحن لدينا اليوم من القوة، لأنه هلا بلش ينقال إنه طيب الموضوع المالي تبع حزب الله شو تأثيره ليكم. لدينا من القوة ولدينا من البنية التحتية ولدينا من الكادر البشري ولدينا من الإمكانات ما يجعلنا نعبر كل هذه المصاعب إن شاء الله.
Over the past few weeks, several events have indicated that Nasrallah is going against the Iranian general. Nasrallah pulled half of the Hezbollah forces that had been fighting for Bashar Assad in Syria. Nasrallah has ignored Soleimani's orders to send back to Syria half of the Hezbollah forces. He's tried and failed to convince Nasrallah to relent. In meetings between senior Hezbollah officials and commanders, Nasrallah issued many complaints against Soleimani's tactics in Syria, claiming they would not be able to stand up against U.S.-Israeli air power. Nasrallah also complained about the low quality of the Shiite militias and said they were unreliable in combat. Iraqi militia chiefs have agreed to communicate with Nasrallah in Beirut rather than Soleimani. The Ayatollahs and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps chiefs realize the damage that could be done in Syria and Lebanon if the escalating disputes are not resolved soon.
Last Thursday, Russian warships headed towards the Syrian port of Tartus for an offensive in Idlib. The flotilla consisted of 5 Russian Black Sea Fleet warships.
Debka File military sources claim that 2 of the ships were carrying Russian Marines or special forces prepared to attack rebel groups in Idlib. The strongest rebel militia, which rules the province, backed by 50,000 men under arms, is supported by Turkey militarily and financially. Ankara has sent officials to Moscow to avert the Russian-Iranian-Syrian offensive to recover Idlib for the Assad regime. Ankara is striving to make the province an area of Turkish influence. Erdogan is concerned that the battle for its recovery to the Assad regime will send 1 million refugees into Turkey. And now for a roundup of this week's regional stories you may have missed, the news in brief. The Israeli agritech company Biofeed has developed a new eco-friendly pest control method to manage fruit flies. These annoying pests end up costing millions of dollars in lost crops. The system is an alternative to insecticide and pesticide and is being used in India to help repair their damaged mango industry. Biofeed's founder, Dr. Nimrod Israeli, signed a deal with Chief Minister Vijay Rupani, which will aim to tackle an invasive breed of fruit flies in India. Israeli says that Biofeed is part of the future of pest control and doesn't involve chemicals or spraying.
This is a device that you put on a tree or anywhere that you like. And here we have a small dispenser with what we call our Coca-Cola formula. It is a secret formula containing a smell. We put it inside, it starts dripping a few drops a day, which is good up to 1 year. India is a major market, is a leading market, and the one we like. And that is because we know they have that pest. We already experience it. In India, we are through most of registration, and we saw that infestation is decreased by 95%, meaning from 90% of fruit infestation of 50% to between 1 to 10% infestation only. Startup Nation Central is great for Biofeed because Biofeed as a technological company really needs help in marketing, in getting to investors, to distributors, getting feedback about how it presents itself and so on. And this is exactly what we get.
21 filmmakers from 14 countries wrapped up their films during the 5th annual Jerusalem Film Workshop. The participants were selected from hundreds of applicants around the world. In the workshop, they studied cinematography, editing, screenwriting, and directing, while getting to experience the local culture of the Holy Land. The final films from the workshop were a series of documentaries portraying interesting residents of Jerusalem, including a falafel vendor, an ultra-Orthodox artist, and a pair of Israeli and Arab boxers. The workshop is facilitated by renowned Israeli filmmakers Gal Greenspan, Roy Kurland, Adi Bar Yosef, and Maya Fisher.
That's all for this week's edition of the Debka File. We'll be back with you next week for exclusive news, insight, and analysis from the Middle East. Make sure to check out our Facebook page at Israel English News and our website, iltv.tv. I'm Yael Shir. Thanks for watching.